Hello, Oxford. I'm Michael Barton, and I'm here today to talk to you about the future of autism and neurodiversity in the workplace. But in order to talk about a world imagined, I feel we need to bring everyone up to speed so we understand what things are like today. We can't possibly talk about the future if we don't understand the present. So my talk today is entitled, Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is. Neurodiversity has two common definitions. The first is a synonym for cognitive diversity. Different people process information in different ways. If I gave each of you a pen and paper and asked you to draw me a picture, chances are you would all draw me something different. The second definition, and the one that I will focus on today, is an all-encompassing term for conditions such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, OCD, or Tourette's. However, upon diagnosis, the focus on a person suddenly shifts towards what they cannot do. However, as an optimistic autistic person, I don't like being defined by what I can't do. I mean, nobody wants to be defined in this way. So if anything, society needs to appreciate our neurological differences rather than shun us for not being like the rest of the population. Autism is defined by the deficits a person displays in social situations. It's often referred to as a developmental condition, meaning that autistic children don't develop at the same rate as most people. But this doesn't mean that we cannot learn the required social skills. It just takes us longer and often with more explicit teaching. So, I'll tell you a little bit about my journey, which started when I was born, much like everyone else's. My parents realized early on that I was different. And this was epitomized as a non-verbal 2-year-old with a diagnosis of PDD-NOS, or Pervasive Developmental Disorder Not Otherwise Specified. This is quite a broad diagnosis, which basically meant that I wasn't developing in a typical fashion. At the time, this was a common precursor to autism, and aged 7, I was diagnosed with high-functioning autism, with a caveat to use strategies for Asperger's syndrome. Nowadays, the preferred term is autism, or using the identity-first term autistic. So now talking about my education. Obviously, education is an investment into a person's life, even though they may not appreciate it until they are an adult. At which point, the return on investment is not only a literal and financial investment, but it impacts people in innumerable other aspects as well. So, with my education, it started off in a special unit, receiving speech and language therapy, then going on into mainstream school with one-to-one support, and then on to help with my English GCSEs. And it's thanks to this support that I now have 10 GCSEs, 3 A-levels, and a degree in physics. And since graduating, I've been working full-time as a data analyst for the past 7 years. If you look back 20 years, the me you see today would certainly be a world imagined to my parents and teachers at the time. But things change when somebody leaves school or officially becomes an adult. I applied for and was in receipt of the Disabled Student Allowance, or DSA, while I was at university, which meant that I could access support there. The thing is, the way that DSA works is that they were expecting me, an autistic student with the communication difficulties that entails to arrange for support and access it at times all planned proactively by me. Do you see where I'm going with this? Having to proactively get help and access support when it's something that I find inherently difficult to do is just filled with irony. However, I did get through university and graduated with a BSc Honours degree in physics. But the question I really want to pose to you today is, why are only 29% of autistic adults in employment? According to the ONS, this is the second lowest figure for any specific condition and was the lowest in the previous year. Certainly, a world imagined would see this figure being considerably higher, the equivalent for disabled people being 54%. And we also have the highest pay gap at 33.5%. So autistic adults are paid a third less than their neurotypical counterparts. It's one thing to talk about autistic people in employment. However, one of the biggest barriers that we face is actually getting a job in the first place, or the interview process. I mean, one thing we're always encouraged to do in interviews is to sell ourselves. I am not open to prostitution. Vague, open-ended questions, which are common in interviews, I also find uncomfortable, such as, tell me about yourself. Oh, my special interest was Pokemon. And we also get questions such as, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? In a mirror? An autistic person's instinct is to take everything that's said to them in a very literal fashion. I talk about this in my first published book, It's Raining Cats and Dogs, but this can prove problematic in the workplace. I've learned that if somebody says to me at work, "Can I grab you for a minute?" I've learned I shouldn't say, "I have a girlfriend." But even when we start at the bottom of the proverbial career ladder, our entry-level job will not be the same as yours. I couldn't work in a Starbucks today, much less when I was 16 years old, and we're less likely to have the required work experience or social skills in the first place. Now, if this wasn't bad enough, the decision to hire a particular person isn't always rational. Even when asking for feedback, which you usually have to proactively do, there's almost no way to prove that you didn't get the job due to discrimination. However, any disabled person that will have applied for many jobs will almost certainly have had that feeling. Once a person is in employment, employers are required by law to consider reasonable adjustments, which are small changes that can make a big difference if a candidate discloses a condition. Many reasonable adjustments are often quite easy to implement and can be low cost or even free. A few examples here include having your own dedicated parking space, which removes all of the stress and anxiety when it comes to getting into work, potentially not finding a space, potentially being late, which means you could potentially get fired, all because you can't find a parking space. It also can be very helpful to have a fixed desk in a quiet corner of the office, which is particularly important given that hot desking is such a popular thing nowadays, where people can choose where they sit. I've also found having dedicated focus time to be crucial for my productivity, where other colleagues cannot disturb me so that I can exclusively focus on my work, which is what I'm paid to do, without being disturbed by other people. And the advent of remote working is also beneficial because that completely eliminates all of the stress of commuting. I mean, nobody wants to be crammed into a tube in the London Underground like sardines, where your only coping mechanism is Candy Crush. The organizational tools once you're in work have also proven really beneficial for me. In my previous job working in a data team, we used a piece of software called Jira, which is a common tool used for data teams, web development teams, and software teams to help organize and manage the team's workload. It's based on the Agile framework, where almost everything is written up, put down in writing, and discussed as a team and allocated appropriately. So it's all very nice and neat and organized. And if somebody did come to me with an ad hoc request, I felt that I could push back and say, I don't have the capacity for this. Please create a ticket and we will then prioritize it accordingly. What I find interesting is that this was not put into place as a reasonable adjustment for me. It just works. It's as if the bits of the job that I struggled with, the bits that my brain found difficult, was subcontracted to somebody else to do, which meant that I could be buried in code and databases and spreadsheets without having to worry about other people. Many companies nowadays have a diversity and inclusion group, which often talks about gender, race, or disability. These have risen to prominence since the Black Lives Matter movement, and rightly so. But the least talked about area of diversity and inclusion is neurodiversity. This is despite the fact that 1 in 7 people, or 15% of the population, is neurodivergent. What doesn't help is that 72% of people don't share that they are neurodivergent in the workplace as they are worried about career impact. If we think about every other possible reason, I would be willing to bet that the vast majority of neurodivergent people, diagnosed or not, do not feel comfortable disclosing in the workplace. So that uncertainty, unfamiliarity, and being unsure of what support is available is a very real struggle. Now let's look at employment in a different lens. I may require some reasonable adjustments to make the most of my abilities in the workplace, but companies pay their employees tens of thousands of pounds a year to work for them. So why would they not spend a little bit of more time and a bit more effort to understand us, understand how we operate, and ultimately understand how work can be optimized for everybody? Because it's not like the school system where everybody has to meet the same minimum standards. You let your star employees shine so that you can be more successful and you can make more money. Because it's all about profit these days, right? One of the main things that I think people struggle to understand about autistic people is our uneven or spiky profile. This is basically the fact that we can be exceptionally good at some things and yet hopeless at others. Certainly during my time at school, I was in top set in maths, in the bottom set in English. Age 7, I was able to use Pythagoras' theorem, but struggle to connect simple facial expressions to emotions. And this is a shout out to Daniel Radcliffe for helping me out with his Mind Reading, the Interactive Guide to Emotions. Aged 10, being able to make friends and have other people befriend me because of my vast knowledge of Pokemon, and yet struggling to make friends myself. Even as an adult, I'm simultaneously working full-time as a data analyst, and yet I would really struggle in a frontline retail job. Another way to put an uneven profile, some people say that autism is a disability. Some people say that autism is a superpower. I see it as a superposition of both in the same person. Like I've said, some things that I'm incredibly good at and I find easy, but put me in a different context, in the wrong situation, and I would definitely struggle. But one final point that I will add. Your knowledge and understanding of autism and neurodiversity must not stop with me. I am just one autistic person out of over 1 million in the UK alone, which means you can completely ignore me if you so wish. But one thing I like to do is articulate my way of thinking and that of many autistic people in a way that many of my compatriots are unable to. I cannot stress enough that autism is a communication difficulty, and yet public speaking or giving a monologue is something that I am able to do because I have practiced it extensively. Listening to me for 15 minutes is just the beginning. But what I recommend is you've got to move away from saying nice ideas, putting nice thoughts out there, or just making promises that you can't fulfill without accountable action plans. Now, this concept was quite eloquently put by Greta Thunberg as blah, blah, blah. So my action plan for everybody here today is to further your understanding of autism and neurodiversity, starting with kindness, compassion, and open-mindedness, right the way through to re-evaluating the interview process and proactively looking for reasonable adjustments in the workplace so that we can bring our full selves to the world of work. That, to me, certainly would be a world imagined. So to summarize, you need to put your money where your mouth is.